There we go. And so, as those who have participated in the past are aware, the format is pretty straightforward. We are together for about 90 minutes. The first 30 minutes, roughly, we are going to be speaking with Janine about her own career and some of the things that she brings to a career conversations discussion from the perspective of what's brought her to where she is now and maybe where she's going later on. We're then going to switch to the actual book conversation, and in particular, I'll be asking Janine a few questions as we move forward, and then we're going to open it up to others. If you have questions or comments in the last little while, we can continue on with additional questions, not a problem. But if there are questions or comments, we would love to hear from you as well. And so I'm going to stop sharing for a quick second, and I'm just going to go through a couple of guideposts as we move forward. So as a reminder, the format for tonight we've already talked about. I'm asking for microphones just to stay muted until we get into the final Q&A as we move forward. If you've got a question the last half hour, absolutely unmute and put your question up, put your hand up. The chat is also open, and feel free to use the chat if you do have questions or comments during the conversation as we move forward. We are recording the session just as a reminder, and for Ontario lawyers, tonight's session is eligible for an hour and a half of credit, 1 hour for professionalism. And given the topic and the way that she writes the book, Janine's book has also been credited for 30 minutes of EDI credit from the Law Society of Ontario. The last thing that I wanted to say is that the goal from the conversations is to inform, to learn together, to have open, brave and powerful conversations. And I always acknowledge Elise Hakenkora's material where she talks about brave spaces being exhausting. And so rather than brave spaces, I've converted to asking that we are all engaged in an accountable space. We're each responsible for ourselves, our intentions, our words, and our actions. And it means entering a space with good intentions, but understanding that aligning your intent with action is the true test of commitment. I've already sent out through email to those who have participated or registered the link to her accountable space guidelines, and I encourage you to use them. I've shared them with other people and in other settings as well. I'm going to apologize ahead of time. I'm suffering from a bit of a cold, and so I sound more nasally than usual. So my apologies ahead of time, but we're going to open it up. And Janine, welcome today, and I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to jump in for sure.
My pleasure. And so, first thing, we always love to hear what people's career journeys are all about. And that oftentimes gives us incentive and inspiration, whether in law or outside of law, because there's always a lot of related journeys that we bring in, things that we want to think about. You've got an incredible career story, including being a CPA, an accountant, a passionate keynote and TEDx speaker, founder and CEO, and I recently looked at the academy as well, the Wealth Building Academy, and of course, author of one book so far that we know of. Can you share with us a little bit about your personal journey so far, the highs, the lows, and how did you know it was time to sort of pivot from one to another, and why did you do so?
Yeah, I think, one of the most interesting things and one of the most important things for me has always been knowing what I do like to do, but also even more importantly, knowing what I don't like to do. And so I actually went into the Faculty of Engineering as a jumping off point from high school because I was good at math. And in high school, I would say most high schools do a terrible job, and that's nothing on high schools, but do a terrible job of sharing with students like what the potential careers are going to be. You might hear lawyer, doctor, nurse, engineer, and that's kind of about it. And I went in with an 8-year plan, actually, when I was 18, and that blew up in about one semester. And I really found myself hating the work in engineering and, digging kind of more into like what the career would look like and being like, this is definitely not for me. So from there, I actually ended up switching into the Faculty of Science and Agriculture. I was going to be a nutritionist. And then organic chemistry was very, very challenging. And I also felt like if I graduated with a general science degree, I wasn't going to be able to get a job. So both of my parents and my grandfather were actually accountants. So I had been, running and hiding from that for at least 2 years at this point. And my mom finally said, why don't you take an accounting class? And I remember taking that first accounting class and it was like a light bulb switch went off and I was like, damn it, like this makes sense. And so kind of, dove right into accounting and business school after that. And that's also kind of at the same time my passion for personal finance started. So as I was doing my accounting degree and ultimately my CPA designation after that, what I was really finding is I was auditing and consulting for some of the biggest companies in Canada, and nobody was teaching me how to manage my money. And really when I looked around and found other CPs and started to have conversations with them, they were kind of in the same place. And so that is kind of where my interest in writing about personal finance and then ultimately running workshops and teaching about personal finance kind of came from. And then kind of more professionally, once I completed my CPA designation, I knew I didn't want to stare at a screen for 15 hours a day. And it was getting to the point where I didn't like what I was doing anymore. So I knew it was time for a change. And so after about half a decade in public practice, I ended up in tech, doing some consulting for many different businesses around the world for another half decade, and then ultimately went out on my own because I guess the passion around personal finance and ultimately women and money, it never went away and it just kept kind of picking away there. And I knew it just kept getting bigger and bigger, and eventually wrote the book and decided that I needed to give this entrepreneurship thing a try.
I love it. First of all, the fighting what your parents did for the longest time was one thing that you started discussing, and then all of a sudden the light bulb going off. Like, yeah, I actually kind of like this. But you talk about personal finances, and specifically for women. At what point, or what was there something that happened, or something that you recognized or noticed that made you think, you know what, more than general personal finances, I'm really interested in this whole issue on personal finances for women in particular?
Yeah, I think about probably 6 years ago. I'm sure it existed before that, but that's kind of when I first came across it. I really felt the narrative, and I still think it's true today. The narrative around women and money was, our shoes are too expensive, or we buy too many lattes, and avocado toast if you're a millennial is why you can't buy a house. And I was like, that can't be it. Like that, if that was it, we would have figured it out.
Mhm,
And so that's really what led me into the research of, what actually impacts us in our financial systems that we've set up in our society. What of those actually impacts women's ability to make money, to save money, to invest money, and to ultimately have wealth? So I would say that was kind of, I think those conversations were things that were kind of bothering me,
mhm,
because there are men that spend hundreds, if not thousands, of dollars on sports tickets
mhm,
for something, and nobody ever tells them that that's why they don't have wealth, or they bought too many beers with the guys, or whatever the gender stereotypes are
mhm.
going to be. I just felt like that wasn't what was being said to men, so why was it being said to women?
I'm just curious, and I know we haven't had this conversation, but did you have this conversation with your mom as you were sort of exploring this, wondering whether or not she'd had those conversations, or if the conversation had been in existence before you came into the field, or is this a newer narrative?
I would say it's probably a newer narrative.
Mm,
What's interesting is my parents never really talked a lot about money. It was always like just save money, save for a rainy day. They never talked about investing. They never talked about earning an income in terms of like what was a reasonable income.
mm,
I remember they told me that I could learn what they made on my 18th birthday. Like they would tell me how much money they made, and that was the first question I asked when I turned 18. So obviously I've been interested in money for a long time.
mhm.
But I don't know if they maybe even realize that those narratives happened. And I think some of that too, when we look at the history, it's really only been one full generation of women having financial rights. So it wasn't until the 70s that women could have their own mortgages. And it
Mhm.
wasn't until the 60s that women could have their own bank accounts without a father or a husband co-signing. And like my mom was alive in the 60s. So I think also there's a generational piece of like not talking about money because it is so taboo.
You know, it's interesting. The stats and the dates and the information that you provide in the book are overwhelming sometimes, because you realize how current or how recent a lot of what you're discussing is, as you said, like I'm, born in late 60s and I've lived in the 70s, and some of the dates that you had were in the 70s and 80s, and being new things for women to deal with. So it's not that it's something in, really old times. It's current and it's still impacting a lot of us. We'll get into the book, but I'm really grateful for that information. Let's just stick to your career for a few seconds more. Serendipity, one of my favorite words, and I always love to find out. I know that you took a little bit of you started off in engineering, and I'm curious if you were one of a few women or one of the only women in an engineering program. But were you planning things out along the way, or did you actually allow yourself to be open to serendipity, to be open to that possibility?
So I was one of three women in my first year engineering class.
Out of how many? So one of three out of how many in your
Oh
class?
God, I don't know how many were in that class, a couple hundred.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. And they do the whole like look to the right, look to the left. One of you is going to be gone next year. And I was like, it's me, bye.
I'm out of here.
But going back to what I said at the very beginning, I actually had planned out my life for 8 years. Like I was going to go to engineering school and then I was going to go to med school. So I had this plan. I love plans. I
Mhm.
love a good plan. But I had this 8 year plan sorted and it blew up kind of it blew up in a good way, but at the time it felt very overwhelming, but it blew up one semester in. And I think from that point, even though I was quite young at that time, what I really learned was um, obviously things are going to change and things are going to happen to you. And an organization, it's a not-for-profit in Alberta, actually, called Money Mentors. I had found out about them and I really wanted to work for them. And, I had odd jobs kind of throughout my university, like part-time. And I ended up actually just like using their like Q&A box on their website and asking them like if they had any job openings. And 6 months later, they got back to me saying that they could use some help like administratively in their office. And I was like, okay. So I went and did that. And ultimately, that ended up leading to a role where I actually got to, in my last couple of years of university, go around and talk to high school students about money.
Mm,
And I
wow.
think that is the reason that I ended up getting my job in tech because that's kind of what launched my public speaking career.
Mhm.
And I remember in the interviews for the tech company, because I was going to be presenting to a lot of CFOs and C-suite individuals, they were like, "We're really interested actually in not so much in the work, the accounting work you did. Like we got it, you're good at numbers and all that, but your ability to present and your ability to public speak." So absolutely believe in serendipity. I think if I hadn't have I don't know what made me reach out through the like Q&A box or the contact form on their website, but if I hadn't have done that, I don't think I would be where I am today.
Wow. No, I think that you never know that one step that you take that might make the difference in a career. And let me ask you, because you said, yeah, you've got the numbers, you understand the numbers, you're really good at it. One of the things that I oftentimes hear about people, the imposter syndrome or lack of confidence. Did you know that you were a good public speaker and that you've got that as well, or was that something you had to build yourself up for? I'm just curious.
I think I've always liked it and I've always been
Okay.
told I was good at it.
Hmm.
It is like anything else. I think it's a skill that you have to practice. I remember in grade 4, we had to present some paper we wrote, and I had done it on seals and sea lions. And I remember my parents came, and it was like a whole big deal. You had to present this PowerPoint. PowerPoint was new, and I remember the room going black, like while I was standing there and I had to sit down. So I don't know if that was nerves. I don't know if like I was, standing with my legs locked as, a little grade 4 girl, but I remember that very vividly. And then kind of where I am now, where I love standing on stages and talking. I was a competitive dancer growing up too, so like I know the stage, I like it, but
Hmm.
definitely I would say the public speaking um, piece of it, it does take practice, but I do think it is a skill that a lot of people need in their life at some point in time because how you articulate things is how you get people to buy into your ideas.
It's interesting you just said right now, and you sort of bypassed it. You were a competitive dancer, you said, right? Early on.
Yeah.
How has that, if at all, impacted what you're doing now? Because that was probably a really large part of your life
It
for a
was,
long
yeah.
time. So how has that impacted, if at all?
I think definitely work ethic and not being I guess, scared or worried to have to do something over and over and over again to kind of work
Mhm.
that muscle. Obviously literally when you're a ballet dancer, but kind of more figuratively when you're an adult. And then I would say also time management. I was dancing, 30 some hours a week and going to high school, university. So really trying to figure out how to balance things. I think that was definitely a skill I learned from there as well.
So this was during university as well, not just in elementary or high school for you.
Um, like the first 2 years of university, and then I
Okay.
kind of became too old to age
Never.
out.
Hopefully, you find ways to include dancing in your life at some other point in some way, shape, or form. So you also have built this company, the Wealth Building Academy. Tell us a little bit about what the incentive or the inspiration to go out on your own was, and specifically this academy.
Yeah, so COVID was interesting. I was doing a ton of in-person workshops for like small groups of people, whether that be like um, kind of groups in Calgary or what have you. And then the pandemic hit, and I couldn't meet
Hmm.
for however long. And so that's really when I decided that I wanted to create kind of an online learning platform. I always get questions on how to invest.
Hmm.
And investing, as you know, in my book, is one of, I think, the key pieces for closing the wealth gap. I don't think we can do it without it.
Hmm.
And again, I think there's a lot of factors as to why women don't necessarily invest or kind of shy away from investing. And it's not just women either. So I knew I wanted to create a course because I can't sit down with every single person and walk them through building a
Yeah.
portfolio from scratch. That would take many, many hours. And there are also hurdles like you have to open the account and you have to, send in all your information to the bank. And for some reason that takes like 3 weeks
Mhm.
for them to do anything. So I created the Wealth Lab, which is an online course to teach women how to invest. And I really wanted it to be approachable in bite-sized chunks to either help people who can't sit or don't want to sit for an hour, but also like moms.
Yeah.
We cannot sometimes sit for an hour and listen to a lesson. So I really needed it to be in bite-sized chunks. And then I really wanted to create a community aspect of it as well, and have a place where women can feel that it's okay for them to ask questions around that. So that's kind of the I would say one of the key products. Of my company, and we're really just on a mission to help women learn to invest and build their wealth. From a really educational standpoint, I don't sell any investment products.
Hmm.
And I think that that is also a key piece because sometimes you go to the bank and the advice you're getting is not always the best advice for you.
And it's not just for younger women. I've got to admit, there's always this fear of investments, and I'm, well into my 50s, and I still have this, oh my God, do I understand this? I'm so stupid. I don't understand how to put this together. And I was looking through your curriculum, fantastic curriculum, and it's done at people's self-pace, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken,
you
right?
get lifetime access. So
Yeah.
again, I felt it had to be that way again because it's like, okay, if you are signing up for an account or trying to do something or you need to take a step away from it, it's okay. You can come back
Yeah.
later.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I'm going to be looking at that again on a later time, because I think there's different stages of our lives as women where financial conversations, financial decisions are absolutely critical. Different, well, throughout our lives, but at different stages in particular. So let's get into the book in particular. And you've sort of told us about it, but I just want to start off reinforcing. What was your why? Why did you need to not just write this book, but you did a lot of research. A lot of research went into this book. Spending the time to do the research, sharing that information with the world. What was your why in particular, Janine?
So I think there's kind of like two pieces there. I think I knew I always had something to say from a book perspective. I actually didn't know if it was going to be one or two books at the beginning, because there's such a heavy emphasis on personal finance. But I really felt that there was so many books out there that talked about budgeting and this and investing, and those are great. But I really felt like you couldn't have like the micro and the macroeconomic factors separately without kind of talking about them as a whole. And I knew that these conversations needed to happen. And that's why I think it was so important for me to write the book so that those conversations could start to happen, whether it's, on a stage somewhere or
Hmm.
even in a book club, right? Like, I
Yep.
think that's where a lot of people sometimes feel safe to have those conversations.
Yep.
And then why I did all of the research, I think I look young. I'm not gonna let anyone guess my age, but I have been told many times in my life that I don't know what I'm talking about because I'm young. It's
You've
usually
actually
about
been
white
told that?
men. Oh yeah. Oh
Mm,
yeah.
okay.
And I mean, I worked in the financial and the tech sector, so very heavily male dominated.
Mhm.
I was told once in a meeting that they wanted to bring in a different consultant because I didn't look like a stereotypical accountant. Um, and so I think my weapon has always been statistics because in my mind, you can't argue with them. I know there's people that do, but I felt like it really kind of gave credibility to the argument. And if I could make it kind of bulletproof, then people would have to take it seriously.
It's, from the perspective of lawyers, it's the evidence that you bring in, right? You bring
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
evidence, make a strong case, and it's hard to do away with it. So I'm glad to have that information. And as I said, one of the things that I really appreciate about your book were the statistics that you offered and the data and the history that you offered. So definitions. Lawyers love definitions, as you obviously like to. Two words or two phrases that I want you to just to be able to put us all on the same platform. One is the pink tax. You have a definition for that in particular. I know it's broad, but you have a definition that you use. And then financial feminism. I don't know if you created that because I'm seeing it mostly in your book. So let me hear about your definitions for both the pink tax and financial feminism.
Yeah, so the pink tax is a term coined in the 90s, and it's really the difference in gendered pricing of items. So, walk into any Shoppers Drug Mart or the pharmacy section, and you compare two products, one men, one women's, and they're different prices, even if they're the exact same. And if they are the same price, usually the women's product has a lower volume, so less milliliters, less ounces, that type of thing. So it really just is the gendered pricing difference between items that are identical. And then financial feminism, I don't think I came up with that term. I've seen it before, but I'm happy to take some credit for, spreading the word into the world. But ultimately, for me, that just means financial equality for all. We know feminism is a little bit of a bad F word, but ultimately, it just means equality of everybody. And so I want to level the playing field from a financial perspective as well.
Let me just unmute there. So one of the things that struck me, you talked about the part of the research, um, and you talked about your four foundations of financial feminism. You talked about needing to wait 250 years for equal economic participation. Whoa, that seems almost impossible. First of all, can you give us a little bit about those four foundations? And also, later on in the book, you kind of encourage us that it doesn't have to be 250 years. To give us a little bit of a little bit of the foundations, but also then, do we have to wait the 250 years for this to happen?
Yeah, so I definitely don't think we have to wait 250
Hmm.
years. The statistic around 250, I think it's 257. It's probably 255 now, hopefully, since I've written the book. Um, but that statistic is really around global economic equality. So we have to look, we're obviously very concerned about our own personal finances, but I do think we have to look broader as, citizens, and people of the globe ultimately. And so how do we advocate for policies in our own countries, but also globally that will help women build wealth? And I think if we do that, and if we start to pass laws to, there was a petition a couple of weeks ago to two high school girls in Ottawa were trying to have a petition to axe the pink tax. And I was like, I loved it. I obviously signed it and shared it and all that stuff. But it's stuff like that, I think, that really starts to move the needle forward. And then kind of stepping into your own financial power as well. So if we continue to have that kind of head in the sand approach and not build our wealth, it's going to continue for us to take a long time to ultimately close that gap.
Yeah. It's interesting you talk about the pink tax and the differences, and since reading the book, I've been even more cognizant of walking into a Shoppers or into anything else and noticing, okay, is this shampoo really that much different than that
Right?
shampoo, or is this deodorant really that much different than that? And we've been marketed to that, yes, they are quite different. And of course you need the $5 more, the $10 more, whatever the case is. We've got to start being able to make some different choices, and just understanding it, I think, as a starting point. You talked about, so part of the CPD for lawyers for this session is considering, and I'll put this in quotes, best practices for career and profile management as a legal professional, and that includes business of law, strategic planning, leadership, and career and profile management. So financial instability. And some of the five main factors that you mentioned impacting somebody's career, you've probably, I just want to stress, this is women across professions. This is for women across jobs and maybe those who work at home in unpaid labor, as you've talked about. But for professional women, for lawyers in particular, how does financial instability in particular impact one's career? What people maybe not realize the connection between financial instability and career or career
Yeah.
choices? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I think the big one, obviously it's multifaceted and probably quite complex for every person, but the big one that stands out to me is, not being able to leave a certain type of role or a toxic job or a toxic boss um, for your mental health's sake because of money. If there's a job that pays you less, but you can't cover the bills, you really don't have a choice.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I talk about it at one point in the book where, this is not like for professionals per se, but if you're an hourly worker, and your kid is sick, do you choose to stay home with your kid or send them to school? And what's on the table there? Is it the ability to pay the bills, pay the electricity bill, put food on the table? And so when we put people in those situations, it's not really a choice, because both kind of are terrible outcomes and not something that we would wish on anyone. So I think what is so important about financial management and wealth is it gives you options and it gives you freedom. And I think, not enough women talk about it, but we really do have the ability to change the world, I think. Women are coming into trillions of dollars of wealth just through the next few generations, baby boomers passing, and a lot of that money going to their children. And I think we have the ability to kind of redefine what work looks like, what life looks like, what family looks like, what success looks like, and the ability to, again, impact things like women-owned businesses. Can you purchase from businesses you care about, even if they're more expensive? Those types of things I think are critical when it comes to making decisions around financial stability.
Janine, a couple of points that just come up from this for me. First of all, you say we women do not talk about this. What is it culturally, or why is it that women do not talk about money? I think generally many people have a let's not ask about wages, let's not talk about our expenses. But what is it about women in particular? What have you found that keeps us from talking about money?
So again, most of my answers are always multifaceted because I do think that there is multiple factors that come into things. But we talked a little bit about earlier that it's really only been one generation of being able to be financially independent. So we haven't really seen a ton of examples. My mom worked, and I know that when I was growing up, I don't know if that was the norm. There was working moms, but they were kind of like part-time, and they were always on the field trips, and that was great. But my mom was, actually at the firm that I worked at. She was a senior manager there when I was growing up. So I think we haven't seen a ton of examples of it, but also I would say, like, if you want money, women are told that they're greedy or crass.
Mm,
And then if we marry men that make more money than us, we're gold diggers. So
mhm.
there's also like a lot of societal stereotypes around these types of things. And I think that can lead women to shying away from it. I don't know if I worked at a tech company, so I would, come in after lunch or whatever, and I would always hear like a group of guys being like, I invested in this startup, or, you know, oh, this stock is doing this. And I never really found myself in rooms where women were having those conversations. It usually was around like, oh my God, hi, I spent like $500 at the mall at lunch.
Yeah.
And I think also sometimes that kind of like letting women kind of get away with being bad at math.
Hmm.
Maybe that's not a very popular opinion, but I think sometimes we also kind of push those stereotypes on women, and then they fall into those stereotypes. So again, I think it's multifaceted, but I do think it's also kind of who you surround yourself with.
Yeah. No, I think who you surround yourself with and starting to have those conversations and normalizing the conversations
Totally.
is so really critical. The other part that you said is in terms of being able to make choice in terms of our careers. And I oftentimes, so I went to school, and you make this comment, I went to school when tuition was really low. I didn't have to worry about it. I could work a summer and my tuition would be paid off. And then I started working at the law school, and I was there when we introduced the first of several tuition hikes. And I remember that was the one time I don't cry at my job, and that was the one time I actually cried in front of my boss when the first tuition hike came in, because I knew that we were changing things and not necessarily for the better, because many conversations afterwards with career conversations with students was, I really want to do X, but now with this debt that I have to do Y. And your comment about being able to make choices, I think tuition has been, and you mentioned it in your book, a factor that has been navigating one of the decisions that we have to make based on the tuition and the debt load that we take on. And, I don't know if that's been your experience or if that's one of I know that you mentioned in the book, so I just commented on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think university should be free because I think
Mhm.
that there are probably lots of people that would be really good doctors or architects or artists that don't go into things because they
Yeah.
can't afford it. And we're basically just saying like, okay, well, really only if you have money or you have the ability to take on that much debt,
Mhm.
um, you're allowed to kind of be that thing in society. And I think we're missing out on a ton of really great and talented people.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a whole conversation that we can have.
Yes.
Um, Outraged. I like how you did that little outraged. At page 55, you talk about the ripple effect of the wage gap because it impacts savings, investing, and it fuels a wealth gap. So you start from something that might be, known wage gap, but then it has that impact down the road. And the statistic that really threw me when you said globally women only hold 30% of all wealth. I had to reread that a couple of times. Can you tell us a little bit more about this impact and the ripple effect that happens?
Yeah, so the wage gap we've all heard of. I think right now in Canada, the new kind of statistics were just released by the Canadian Women's Foundation. I think we're sitting at about 89 cents on the dollar, which is good, but usually that's only for white women. So when I say good, I mean better, not good. Obviously, we want
Yep,
that to go away. But
better.
I think, the challenging thing is any level of intersectionality we add to that just makes the wage gap worse, right? So if you're a person of color, or if you're neurodivergent, or if you're disabled, it's just going to be compounded. And so we're earning less, which means we have less money to begin with. And then we're hit with the pink tax, which means we have to spend more just to exist in society. And then from there, that ultimately means we're saving less and investing less. And we know women also live longer than our male counterparts. So we actually need more money, not less. And so that's ultimately kind of the things that do fuel the wealth gap. And we talked about this a little bit earlier, but wealth ultimately is power, right? Power to influence policy. Usually, government officials on average are wealthier people or come from a wealthier background. If you want to be able to purchase from women-owned small businesses, usually that's more expensive. If you want to invest in companies that kind of aren't in alignment with your values, obviously that is going to cost money. And so, this wealth is power thing that I talk about, I almost want women to make it a little bit bigger than themselves and see that having wealth not only gives them the freedom to have choice in their life, but also gives them the power to impact our society in a positive way that's better for everyone.
You talk about women, and I wonder how much of this conversation you start having with high school students. I know that you said that your part of your early on experience was dealing with presentations to high school students, but women were previously young girls who are taught not to have these conversations or these expectations. Something you just said, just the way that you worded it, we're spending more just to exist in society. And even as a young girl, being able to think about that, why do we need to spend more just to
Yeah.
exist in society? That was riveting for me as you just said that. but how do you get to an earlier conversation? How do you bring the pipeline in to have this conversation with our young girls and our
Mhm.
young I'm a mother of a son, so
Yeah,
our
same.
sons and daughters earlier on. So how do you have
Yeah.
that conversation earlier, Janine?
I'm trying. I'm working actually with a private school right now in Calgary to try and get financial literacy and some of these conversations into the curriculum. Um, it's it's interesting though, because so the students have right now, we're just working on like a bit of a pilot where this private school has institute days where they have a whole bunch of options you can choose from, kind of career based. So there's an HR one, there's a financial literacy, what have you. And the first session I ran, I think we had about 13 students in the class, and there was one girl. And I
12
was,
boys? 12 boys. Oh
oh,
no.
it's so important, of course, for everyone to get
Yeah.
financial literacy and understanding. And I actually ran into the woman who was running the HR session afterwards, and she said I had one boy. And I was like, well, isn't that just stereotypes,
Yep.
right? So we're trying, we're working. Curriculums are not easy to change, but I do think social media is a great way to reach our youth.
Mhm.
I've actually had probably close to 10 high school students reach out to me that are doing projects around the pink tax, which is amazing. And
Mhm.
I always will take those phone calls and always will take those meetings to talk with them. So I have hope for the next generation. I think they're doing amazing things, but yeah, it does absolutely need to start as early as possible.
You mentioned that, and I'm trying to remember if in Ontario we have financial literacy as a mandatory curriculum. There was conversation one way or the other that it would happen, but to your point, is it going to be looked at as a relevant issue? So I think the earlier that we can start the conversation, the better off we all will be. But your description of the 12 boys, one girl,
Yeah,
and one
I
girl,
was
12
so
boys.
sad. I was a little
Yeah,
heartbroken.
I believe it. But still keep doing it. Keep doing what you're
Yeah.
doing. So the next area that I wanted to talk to you about, part two, you focus and you talk about self-care, and I'm so interested in learning why you decided to call it self-care. Why did you reference it as self-care? Because um, as with a lot of other professions, the legal profession has a challenge with mental health and wellness in our profession. The
Yeah.
practice of law, legal, starting from legal education and onwards, there's always this challenge with people and stress and mental health. And so, when you say that building your wealth is a form of self-care, you mean it. And I'm just wondering brought us to that, what brought you to seeing it in that way? And can you talk a little bit about that mindset and offering some of the strategies? What are the key takeaways that you have on that part?
Yeah, so what's super interesting is the book actually 4,000 Weeks. If you haven't read it, it will definitely change your perspective on life. The premise is you have 4,000 weeks to live. And so it's a little sobering, but he makes the argument that some of the most unhappy people in our society are people who work for billable hours. And so I'm like, oh, it's lawyers and accountants. Yeah, that's it. Because, I was billing when I was at the firm. I was billing, I was a tax specialist. I was billing to the point one as well. It was annoying. But it's this whole like our time is only worth as much as we can bill for it. And I hate that. I think the billable hour needs to die. That's a whole other
Yep.
conversation. But that really like that one shook me when I read that. I was like, oh, because I was far enough out of it that I kind of was able to look back and go like, oh yeah, there's some miserable people at the firms. And I'm sure it's true for lawyers as
Yep.
well. But I think, this pressure to always bill and you're only as worth I don't want to say worthless. No, you're only worth as much as many hours as you can bill or as much
Yep.
money you can bring into the firm. And that's not true. Obviously your worth is not defined by those things, but I think that definitely impacts mental health from the perspective of, just even I'm friends with some lawyers, like how many hours they work and
Mhm.
busy season for accountants, it's like 100-hour work weeks, easy.
Yeah.
And what is so challenging about mental health and self-care is I think especially women have been fed the narrative that a wine after work or a bubble bath is self-care. And I'm not saying don't do those things. I
Right.
love wine and I love bubble baths, but that is not going to solve your mental health. issues. Therapy is usually a good place to start. Um, mindfulness practices, those types of things, but ultimately, like, you want to reduce your stress, like set yourself up financially. I think we can all think back to the beginning of the pandemic when nobody knew whether or not they were going to get laid off.
Right.
And all of these articles were coming out, Canadians only have $200 from paying a bill, going bankrupt. Oh my gosh, if and ultimately, I think that's why the government had to roll out CERB or CURB or however you say it,
Mhm.
because they were so worried about people not being able to make ends meet. But I can tell you, as stressful as it is to not know whether or not you're going to have a job, being able to go to sleep at night knowing that, like, if you did get laid off and having you have enough money put away for 2 years of paying your mortgage, and you know that that's never going to be an issue, is the kind of peace of mind that I think everyone deserves. And I really think building wealth is absolutely a way to do that. Um, yeah,
Yeah, no, no, and I appreciate that. And let me just ask you this is for some who might be watching or who will be watching later on who are just starting out, for example, and think, but I'm not going to be making those, thousands of, six-figure salary potentially, not in the first little while. Or there are a number of internationally trained lawyers who are coming here. They've had great careers elsewhere, and they're starting from scratch again, for example, or others who are don't have an interest necessarily in being in those big firms and doing that. Can you still build wealth and not have a starting point that you are at the highest bracket in the highest income bracket?
100%. I was paid $41,000 a year when I worked at one of the big four firms.
Hmm.
And I'll tell you, that does not go very far in the city of Calgary, even back, over a
Hmm.
decade ago. But when I started investing, I walked into the bank, which, again, probably not the right thing to do, but back then I didn't know better. And I started investing with $25.
Yeah.
And at that point, it's less about the $25 and it's more about building the habit, because it's $25 now, but then maybe you get a small raise
Hmm.
and you can increase it to $50 and then $100 and then $200. And over the course of a decade, you have made all of these small commitments to your future self, and you really do end up building wealth. You amass your first 1,000, you might amass your first 10,000, and then from there, I mean, your money starts to just do work for you and build wealth without you actually having to do anything. So you absolutely can start with as little as $25. And I think that that's something that our society, I think we're getting better at it with, technology, but definitely when I was starting to invest, it was kind of like, you need to have six figures to start investing. And it's like, no, you
Hmm.
don't. I was like a student when I started investing. I was making like $400 a month. So
Yeah.
you can start with $25.
I like that. I like that. And you said it, it's a commitment to your future self. And I think that is just a good reminder as we move forward. I have to just ask you why you mentioned lattes in your book in particular, in that section about self-care, because we always hear, maybe you're having too many lattes or too many whatever your go-to is, right? And that's why you're not saving. You try and
I
debunk
love
that.
coffee. I love coffee. I think any accountant or lawyer will tell you how much they like coffee. But like I also think like it's nice to be able to go and do that. And I don't think that you should have to, necessarily get rid of all of the things that you enjoy doing. I think I like to think sometimes of money as like calories in a diet, because I think that that's something that people can resonate with maybe more sometimes than money. So, if you're on a diet where all you do is restrict your what you're putting in your body, eventually you're going to get to the point where you just like buy a whole pizza and eat it and you binge. And I think the same is true for money. If you're always depriving yourself, eventually you get to the point where you're like, well, screw it. And then you kind of fly off the handle the other way. So I
Yep.
would rather see people enjoy their life as they're saving. And, I don't want anyone to have to live off of macaroni and ramen,
Yeah.
because that's not healthy either. And that's not a life that is enjoyable. Obviously, I know that that is coming from a very privileged perspective of being able to, purchase groceries that are, fresh produce and those types of things. But I would rather see someone, put $50 away a month and get a latte every week than put away $75 a month. and forego any sense of joy that they might have. Because you also have to live life while you're here, for as morbid as that maybe sounds. We don't know how many days we have left.
Hmm. What was it, 4,000 weeks? Is that what you said?
4,000 weeks, yeah.
4,000 weeks. I'm looking at the book. I do remember you writing about that. And you're right. And I think giving yourself permission to do life your way, but being mindful and being aware of the financial repercussions is what I took away from this book. That it
Mhm.
doesn't have to be your mother's perspective, or it doesn't have to be your father's perspective, or your boss's perspective. Do budgeting, do financing, do wealth gathering in your own way with what matters to you. And I think you've given people permission to do that, which is kind of new in the wealth discussion
Mhm.
conversation, right?
Yeah, a lot of it is around like skimping and saving as much as you possibly can and scraping together. And then you're going to get to retirement and then you can enjoy your money. And, you know, we don't know how many days we have. We don't know how many weeks. One of my close friends, actually, his dad just recently passed last month, and he was only 69.
Uh,
And, there are people that work till they're 70. So
yeah,
imagine amassing all that wealth and then not ever being able, you can't take it with you,
yeah.
not ever being able to have those experiences, to enjoy the things. Another great book is Die with Zero, and his whole notion is you want to get to the end of your life and have nothing in your bank account. You want to have spent it all, with the people that you love or giving to the charities that are impactful to you. And obviously, you don't want to be like have $0 in your bank account. Um, I think that it's a catchy title, but
Hmm.
you don't want to leave this earth with millions of dollars in your bank account having never enjoyed them,
Yeah.
because there are so many memories and things that you could have done. I don't think anyone gets to the end of their life and says, "Oh, I wish I had just put more money into my RSP and worked more billable hours." Like nobody says that.
So very true, and I love the permission that you give. But the other part about wealth building, and we'll go on to the next comment. But you referenced right now that it builds for you, that that it earns money on your own, and you've got a quote. I didn't tag it, but you've got a quote about billionaires. That billionaires are billionaires not because they are earning. Sorry, they're not working for. I think this is the quote. They're not working for their money anymore. They're just earning it based on I'm messing up the conversation, but it's what you're saying. They're not working any harder anymore. They're just starting to let their money earn money for them. Is that right? And then that's something we can
Yeah.
apply even at $41,000 a year potentially, right?
Yeah, I mean, billionaires are a whole other conversation. So I don't think
Yes.
they should exist either. But um, I think, obviously when you get to that point, your money is working hard for you. But I don't think you can say that someone who's earning that much money is working that many times harder than someone working
Right.
for $41,000 a year. I would argue some of our lowest paid occupations are oftentimes some of the hardest
Yeah.
jobs. And so as a society, we almost need to, well, in my opinion, we do need to look at what value we're placing on certain roles in our society. And I think pay needs to be in alignment with how much value they're bringing to society.
On that note, then, one of the things that you spend quite a bit of time on is parenting and mothering. And you've got a statistic on page 166. And there were a lot of things that you wrote that I had to go back and say, what? Really? And this one, stay-at-home moms do 18 different jobs and should be compensated, according to a US study, at US, so for Canada it'll be more, $184,820 per year.
Yeah.
$184,820 for stay-at-home moms. And what do they get right now? Absolute zero. Your book, Advice and Philosophy, moves us to focus not only on ourselves individually, Janine, but also to think about more broadly how to support new mothers and that childcare, parental leave policies, impact of marriage on our finances, and learning and voting about policies and people. What are some of the most critical pieces of advice that you have in both contexts, especially in terms of mothering and in terms of women in relationships?
Um, I have a lot of
Deep
thoughts.
breath. Yeah.
Um, you know, I think as a society, sadly, we have decided that the work that women predominantly do does not have a monetary value assigned to it. But when we think about it, those roles and all of the things that they're doing are ultimately upholding and, in a sense, compensating for usually men, and their careers in the workforce and in our communities. There's a lot of work that is done that is unpaid. And I think that that's a real challenge. And I always get people, especially on TikTok, it's usually the men. They're mad. They're saying, "Well, you wanted to have kids, like you shouldn't be paid for having kids." And it's like, no, that's not the point. Like the point is, women do usually, and obviously I'm generalizing, but usually do all of the unpaid care work, and especially if they're stay-at-home moms, they're a chauffeur. And if you as a man wanted to have kids and you didn't have a stay-at-home wife, you would have to pay for those things to be done. So I think we have to look at as a society again what we value, because right now GDP is our big metric, and I disagree with GDP because of
And
how.
just for those who might not understand, GDP, just a
Oh,
brief
yes.
explanation. Yep.
Sorry,
Gross domestic
GDP is
product. Yep.
gross domestic product. So
Hmm.
that's kind of the output of Canada as a whole economy. But when we look at it, it does not include any unpaid work that usually women do. So if I get into a car accident, that's actually an increase to GDP because I'm filing a claim with my insurance company. I'm probably getting work done on my car. I might need to get a massage or a chiropractor or a physio. If I have an injury, those things I would argue are not great, but they're a positive for GDP. So how we look at growth in our economy and what we actually want to focus on as a country is also really important, because all of that unpaid work, that unpaid care work, is not compensated for. And I don't know if any of you are mothers, but I'm starting to look at kindergartens for our little one, and I am appalled in Alberta that most kindergartens are half day, and if there's a full day kindergarten, they end at 2:30. And my workday does not end at 2:30, even
Yep.
as an entrepreneur. There's still things to do. So, it really, I don't know who is doing this other than if they have a stay-at-home parent.
Yeah, and I'm gonna also take you to the other side of caregiving, which is I helped care for my parents up
Absolutely.
until they passed a couple of years ago, and that again, my sister and I mean, it's just the two of us, but we were the ones that were caring for our parents, and that
Of course.
itself puts, yes, we had to bring in eventually some additional supports because we were both trying to keep jobs going, and we couldn't juggle it all on our own. But there's a value to that, and sometimes it's
Absolutely.
undervalued. Sometimes it's really, really undervalued in that instance. And the other aspect that you talk about, childcare, parental leave policies. When I was starting out in my practice, the firm that I was at loved everybody, except that when I started talking about, because I don't think I was married at the time, but I asked them about parental leave or maternity leave at that point. And the comment that I got was, well, the one female partner that we had took about 2 weeks, and then she was back in the office, within about a month. And I thought, that is not a maternity leave policy that I think I would want. Thank you very much. I understand that others do it. And you know that a lot of professional women, largely because they have to, especially if they're working on their own or in small practices. But parental leave is really, really that much of a challenge for people. And how does it impact wealth when it sets you back? And I love the fact that you said in your book, having a child impacted you financially, or impacted you, there's a reality to it. Not that you're taking anything away from your child, but it's a
No,
reality. Let's talk about that. It is a reality, and we kind of don't want to talk about it. So
we
let
don't
me
want to be
just hear.
ungrateful as women, right?
Of course not, right? How dare we? But the whole issue of parental leave policies, let me just hear your take on it. And then what are the conversations that you want us to encourage us to have, and at what point to have them?
So when it comes to parental leave, I think from a policy perspective, I think it has to be moved out of EI because it sits under EI right now. So that means anyone who is an entrepreneur doesn't usually qualify for maternity or parental leave. And I think that does a disservice to women. I also think that they need to update maternity and parental leave because right now it's, whatever, it's 55%, up to, I can't even remember what it is, but it ends up being like $2,000 a month. And I think we all know that $2,000 a month is not enough to live on,
Yeah.
especially when you're adding in an additional cost like diapers and maybe formula and baby clothes and cribs and all of the things. Children are very expensive. And I think that there should be a mandate that employers have to top it up, within their organizations, or the government covers it all. Because again, I don't think your ability to be employed should dictate whether or not you get government support or money while you're in kind of the most vulnerable time of your life, honestly, is kind of how I felt I was in that situation. There was no way I was going to be able to work when I'm, up for every 45 minutes from 1 a.m. to 7 a.m.,
Yep.
which was our reality for a while. There's no way you're working, and I don't think women should be forced to have to do that. So let's give them the supports they need. And then I also think men need to take parental leave, take paternity leave. We can look at countries that have really great policies, like Sweden. They give 480 days to use before the child is 8, which I love. And there's also countries around the world where it's kind of use it or lose it for men. So if you don't take at least a certain number of days, you don't kind of get that additional time off. And I think when we have policies like that, it does really encourage men to take that time off. And from a male perspective, we know men that are involved and have a relationship with their children actually end up with, better outcomes, better mental health. We know suicide rates are very high for men, kind of in that 35 to 55
Yep.
range. And I would probably, again, it's multifaceted, but I would probably argue a lot of that is because much of their self-worth is tied up in their job only.
Yep.
They don't have relationships outside of that. They don't have relationships with their family, with their friends, etc. And so if we can get men also being involved with their children, and having those relationships, I think it will be better for men, but it will also be better for women because they'll understand how much work it actually is.
Yeah, normalizing it, I think, is really important. Normalizing all of these conversations. It's funny because when it's been 20 plus years that we had our child, but my husband would look at these articles that said the cost of a child to 18 is X. And I used to cringe. Like, don't talk about the cost. We're not supposed to talk about the cost of raising a child. It's such a beautiful thing to be a parent and to enjoy. And he'd be like, can we just look at the dollars and cents and not worry about it? But this perception that if you're talking about money and children, somehow you're lessening the experience. That took me a while to overcome, and I know that that's still something that women, I think, struggle with. I don't know if you've had those conversations with people.
Yeah, I think it's like the being ungrateful piece of it, because there are women that can't have children, and how dare you talk about how expensive or hard it is when there
Hmm.
is women that can't,
Yeah.
or parents that can't have that thing.
Hmm.
And I think we always have to remember that two things can be true at once, right?
Right.
It can be hard and expensive and challenging, and also if you don't have children and you want them, that can also be hard and challenging and expensive. So I think we maybe need to have a little more empathy for both sides of the spectrum.
Good point to that. Thank you for that. Um, One of your chapters is about partners, and I know that you're talking about personal partners, but I wonder if you have any advice for those who are in professional partnerships, whether it's in a large firm or in a small firm with one or two other lawyers or five lawyers, for example. You list a number of steps that a woman should take for richer or for poorer with a life partner, and that sort of starts at around page 169. But do you have some suggestions on how this might translate to conversations with business partners? Well, I use the
Yeah.
phrase law partners, but business partners generally. You're an entrepreneur now, and if you were to join on with a business partner down the road, what kinds of conversations should we be having from a financial perspective with business partners?
I think really, really frank and open and honest conversations is always the correct thing to do, especially when it comes to mixing business and relationships. I would be, asking kind of questions on like, where do we want this business to go? What's our exit strategy? What happens if you need to take money out of the corporation, but I don't need to? And I'm sure there are definitely much smarter lawyers and corporate lawyers probably on this call than I am, but like different share classes can be an answer to that. And so I think really understanding and having a plan of like, if this happens, what's our response, so that we have those guidelines. And it's not that they can't change, but we have those guidelines set out before anything bad happens, so that we kind of have the plan and we're not trying to figure out the plan while the crisis is happening.
Mm.
So I would be asking those questions, and I guess also just like expectations for um, I guess, money being put into the business, who's going to be doing that, what that translates into, what that means. And then if you're employing people, what are your policies around things like maternity and parental leave? What are your policies around pay and pay transparency? Because I think as leaders, we also have a really great opportunity here to create companies and create partnerships and create firms that are more inclusive and help to close the wage gap.
I love the fact that you just reinforced that um, women who are running their own businesses are leaders and they have an impact
Absolutely.
on making the decisions, not just for their own business and for their own staff, but on a broader basis. It does have a trickle effect. It does have a ripple
Ah,
effect, to use that phrase, right? So I think that really is important. So having those conversations, and sometimes just like with personal partners, um, when you start having the conversations, and if you feel like you are too much at odds and things are if you're disagreeing on too many aspects, that might be a warning sign at that point.
ab absolutely, and that can be a reason not to go into business with someone, and I think that that's probably a mistake that you avoided in
Hmm.
those situations. I said at the beginning, it's really great to know what you like doing, but it's even more important to know what you don't like doing, and I think that extends to the people you work with. So for me, like, I would obviously only take on a partner that shared a lot of the same
Yes.
values as me when it comes to what I believe is like fair and equal pay. I'm never going to be like, what is the cheapest amount of money I can get out of someone? I think they should be paid their value. And I don't think that anyone should be working for 40 hours a week and not be able to afford the basic needs. That just doesn't sit well with me. So I would never be able to go into a partnership in business with someone who doesn't believe those things as well.
Agreed, agreed. I'm just wondering if there was ever any pushback on the chapter of For Richer or Poorer, any impact or pushback that you received from anybody reading it in terms of, oh, don't get into the finances of a couple, of a personal couple. I'm just curious if that's sort of old school thinking, or if you were able to put it on the table and people are willing to and able to accept it these days.
I think these days it's more like I would say women, if they're not like involved in their finances, they kind of have like a head in the sand approach. Like, oh, I'm just going to let my
Mm.
spouse
Yeah.
take care of it. And not really like, oh, we should never talk about this. But then kind of once I have a conversation with them or they read my book, they're like, oh, no, I actually need to care about this.
Mhm.
Um, but I think probably my parents' generation or my grandparents' generation, they're like, don't talk about money.
Mm.
Don't, bring it into a relationship. And again, I can go back to, my good friend who his dad passed a month ago. He has been up in Edmonton actually for almost a month now, trying to help sort through all the financial records because his mom just had absolutely no idea where to even start. And, I've said this to many women, but I cannot imagine losing a partner, whether that is death or divorce or separation, whatever it is, the emotional and mental toll that that would take on you, and then to be adding on a layer of financial stress is not something I wish for anyone. So I really do think it's important to have these conversations and to understand um, before anything bad happens.
It's interesting. I used to roll my eyes because my husband and I used to have um, budget dates
I
once a
love it.
week. Well, I used to kind of initially, depending on the time that we were in, it was like, really, we have to have this conversation now. But we would stick to it once a week, once every 2 weeks. And my son, who's now in his mid 20s or early 20s, as a kid growing up, are you having that money talk? It's like, yes, we're having the money talk. And sometimes it would be easy, and other times it would be a little
Yeah.
bit more difficult. But I realize that not everybody has those budget dates or those money talks on a regular basis as a couple. It was something that I hadn't clued in for a long time.
And you make a really good point too of I don't know if you realized you did this, but your children seeing it as an example.
Yeah.
There's actually an allowance gap. Like young girls on average are not paid an allowance at the same rate as little boys. Which I'm just like I shake my head at. But if you never see the adults in your life talking about money, you might, kind of go into adulthood with, your own money stories around those types of things. Like I can use an example. So my son is 3.5. And we started playing store. So he has a little cash register and, we have all the fruits and vegetables and all the things. And, we'll exchange like, money for these groceries. And he's always the cashier anyway. So there was a kid on the playground at daycare that was doing something that he didn't like. He was not being nice. And so my son was like, here's money, stop it. And I was like, okay, we need to have a conversation about that. You can't just pay off people. But, it is really important to start having those conversations around your kids, because if you don't know what they will pick up. They might just think, oh, mommy has this magic card that
Mhm.
I can just pay for things on, and they don't understand where that comes from. And, that might lead to, we might know, like, okay, don't max out your credit card and
Yeah.
and make sure you pay it off every month. But if you never tell your kids that, they might just think, oh, you just tap the card. My son knew at 1.5 how to tap the card on the machine, and I never showed him how to do it. He just saw us. So it is really interesting what children pick up as well when you're having those conversations and talking about money in a way that I think can also include them in the household.
No, absolutely. We would bring my son in periodically to have part of that conversation, so it wasn't sort of this secret mom and dad conversation. You talked about the credit card, and in your book, you also reference how easy it is and how challenging it is to have this cashless society. And I remember my late dad would have $200 in his wallet at all times, and that would be his cash, just the safe cash, just in case. And I never even thought about it until I read your book, where we live in such a cashless society. Everything is electronic that, yeah, having a little bit of cash, not a whole mattress full, but a little bit of
No.
cash is, is really something useful. So tell us a little bit why you came up with that aspect of it too.
Yeah, so I feel like I've had a few interesting experiences around that. So, one actually happened probably half a year ago, where I had gotten a new phone and hadn't put my Apple Pay on it. And
Mhm.
I was meeting a friend for coffee. I was late, and I just like grabbed my phone and left. And I got to the cafe and I ordered a coffee, and I didn't have my credit card with me, but I had like 20 bucks in my purse, and they would not accept cash.
Oh,
Um, and I was like, I looked at my friend and I was like, I'm gonna need to like borrow money to buy this coffee and I can grab it next time or whatever. Like it wasn't a big deal, but I think we've really moved, especially with COVID, with the exchange of money,
yeah.
to a very cashless society. That being said, I was also traveling in Europe when the was it Intract that went down?
Mhm.
Something went down, and like credit cards stopped working. Like there was no way I could pay for anything. And so I think that's also a really interesting piece of like, do you have a little bit of cash on hand if something like that did happen? Or, if this is another really interesting thing that happened to us. It's not actually that interesting, it's kind of scary, but someone tried to port my husband's cell phone number. They were successful in it. And that is very, very scary from the sense of two-factor authentication. So as soon as you port someone's cell phone number, so that ultimately means they take your cell phone number and put it on another phone.
Ooh.
So they would have had like somehow they have had his address and enough information to port this phone number.
Mhm.
We had to freeze everything, because if that person could get our banking password and two-factor authentication on that phone, they would have access. And I actually ended up doing a bit of research around it because I was like, I can't be the only person that's dealt with
Yeah.
this. A woman ended up losing $30,000 because of the exact same scam. So
Wow.
I think having a little bit on hand to get you through some groceries, some gas,
Yeah.
isn't a bad thing.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and that never really. I used to call my dad old school, but I now realize that he was just preparing for that day when he might need that extra bit of cash. He'd always have that amount in his wallet, and we always knew where it was tucked in. And
Yeah.
yeah, so that amount is something to keep in mind. I just want to be mindful if anybody has a question. Otherwise, I do have one more question to ask you, Janine. I'll give a couple of seconds if anybody has a question. But one of the things they may come on later on. One of the things that you really do well in the book is in a number of the later chapters, you talk about you really take us outside of our individual things that we need to do and take us more into sort of policy and voting. 25, chapter 25 on national interest, you've got some, I'm going to call them gut-wrenching statistics. 104 countries restrict the types of jobs women can hold. And I have to say, today, like in this day and age, we still have 104 countries that restrict the type of jobs that women can hold. 18 countries require women to have their husband's permission to work outside the home. Again, I did one of these. Really? Seriously? I guess I'm living in in a naive sense, thinking, no, this doesn't exist anywhere. But 18 countries. 147 countries do not have legal paid parental leave. So, with women who are feeling somewhat overwhelmed by some of the statistics that we see, and going back to the 250 years to make any changes, what would you say for those women who are feeling a little bit overwhelmed, and how can they make a difference? What can they do
Yeah.
to make the difference on a not an individual basis necessarily?
And I think, like I feel overwhelmed by those statistics sometimes too. I wake up and I'm like, man, we still have so much work to do. And I get frustrated because I'm like, why hasn't it moved further? And why haven't we? And in those times I try to remember and remind myself, because I'm a very impatient person, that it really hasn't been that long.
Right.
We've made progress. We're not where we need to be, but we can still celebrate the progress that we've made. But I think when we look at what we can do, I always go back to kind of, as a global citizen, you can build your wealth individually and then take that and do good with it, whatever that means to
Mhm.
you. So, like I said, you can invest in women-owned businesses. We know women-owned businesses receive like just 2% of VC funding, venture capital funding. So you could have an impact from that perspective. You could have an impact from being a manager at your company or running your own company and saying like, no, these are the pay transparency rules we care about, and these are the policies that we're going to do and set an example. But you can also, from a global perspective, say, like, this is how I'm going to vote. I'm going to do my research on how these individuals have treated women. What is the makeup of their cabinet? What policies are they advocating for? And what have they voted on in the past? And I'm not here to tell anyone, I mean, it's very obvious, which way I lean politically. And I write about it in like the intro of my book.
That's right.
There's no surprise. But everyone, we live in a democracy. You have the right to vote however you like. But I would just argue, don't just vote blindly because your parents did it or because your spouse is doing it. Like, what matters to you, what is important to you, and can you get involved even, at a community level? So a great example is, my husband is the treasurer on the daycare board, and we talk about, and questions that I always ask for him to ask at the meetings is like, what kind of raises are we giving these people every year? Because you can impact things in your community just from like small questions like that. Or, are we looking at maybe, we know childcare is like such an important thing in our society, but it's also exhausting. And I know daycare workers work a ton of hours. Like, could we look at a 4-day work week, or, giving them a day off every month? Like, what types of things can you impact in your community? It doesn't have to be, I'm going to wave a magic wand and be prime minister tomorrow and change everything. How can we actually have those changes in our community, in our workforces, in our homes, to start having those conversations to move things forward? Because unfortunately, I don't think it's going to be, wave a magic wand and one day all of
Mhm.
these great policies are going to exist. It's slow, it's tedious, it's frustrating, but it does happen. Kind of every individual doing a little bit and moving our society, moving our progress forward.
I love it. And as you said, whether it's investing in female-owned businesses, whether it's making the decisions about investing, or of asking certain questions, I think all that makes a huge difference. If there's one thing, and I'm going back to what you had said at the very beginning, women tend to be a little reticent about investing. If there's one piece of advice from a personal perspective that you can offer a woman, whether it's her first time investing or if she's kind of dabbled in it, what do you tell women about investing? Apart from take your course, I love that. But apart from
Yeah.
that, what do you tell women? What's one piece of advice that you leave them with in terms of investing?
I'm gonna not answer one piece. I'm gonna give you two pieces because
Okay,
I can't just give you one.
okay.
So the first is women are actually better investors than men. There's a study called Boys Will Be Boys, and it shows that women actually outperform men when it comes to investing because we respond less emotionally to the market fluctuations, which is hilarious because for so
Women
long
are emotional, right? Yeah.
we are emotional. Um, and so I think that, that is really important to remember where we are good at investing. And the other thing I hear a lot is the stock market could crash and all of my investments will go to zero. And I'm here to tell you that if you build a well-diversified, risk-aware portfolio, not just investing in like cryptocurrency or one stock and putting all your money in a penny stock or an oil and gas stock or a tech stock or whatever. If you actually build a well-diversified portfolio that's in alignment with your risk profile, um, you will not have a problem with that. If the entire economy in the stock market went to zero tomorrow, which it won't because the government would not allow that. We've seen bailouts for airlines, banks, blah, blah, blah. Our society would cease to function as it stands now. Like we would have to be like, okay, what can I trade? Here's a water bottle. How much is this worth to you? In terms of just not being able to exchange cash because it would have no value. So that's not going to happen. And if for some reason the apocalypse did happen, your $10,000 that is invested is probably the least of your worries at that point. So I try to remind people of that as well.
I think those are really good reminders for people. And the fact that you say that the research has shown that women are better investors. I don't think we believe that. We haven't taken that on yet. It's not something that most women want to have a conversation with. You go for lunch with your friends. Is investing something? Actually, may I ask you that? Is investing something that you talk about with your friends when you go for lunch? Do you bring the conversation into that or not?
I usually talk about money at some
Okay.
point.
Okay.
I'm a big advocate for talking about salary transparency, so
Yeah.
I'm always asking those questions. I have a lot of my friends that do ask me money questions, which
Okay.
I'm totally good to answer. But I also like this is the nerd in me. And when I was in university, we had like a stock picking club, like where we would meet once a month for coffee, and you'd have to present a stock and why you thought it was a good investment. So my friend group kind of falls into that area as well. So it's not an uncommon topic, but I would say we're also not necessarily the norm.
But to be able to find peers or
Yeah.
find your
Community.
community, right? And I think that's one of the reasons that you started your academy, but also this book, just to get people talking about and feeling more comfortable about having the
Yeah.
conversation. So I think that's really, really critical.
I
Right.
just want, honestly, for women to, if they read the book, say, hey, I heard this interesting statistic or I read this interesting thing, and I want that to be the conversation starter because I think that's how it starts is through conversation and through education.
So let me ask you this. That's for women, and then we're going to wrap up soon. But you and I are both moms of boys, of sons. What do you say to the guys out there who are watching or who are listening or who are reading the book?
I think you can be a great advocate for the women in your life. You can make a more just and fair world for your daughters. And then to my son, I will probably tell him that, at times he's going to need to get out of the way for women, because there have been men that have not gotten out of the way for me, and that has sucked. But there's also been a lot of really great men that have gotten out of the way and said, like, no, what about her?
Mm.
And I'm so grateful to those men as well in my life because we can't do this without them. So I think it was my husband originally who said, "You can't take down the patriarchy without the patriarchy. It's never going to happen. So we need buy-in from everybody."
I love it. I love it. So, just for people who want to learn more about you, learn more about the products that you have available, JanineRogan.com. Here is your email, hello at
Yeah,
JanineRogan.com. I think there's a pardon the comment, but there's a wealth of information on your website.
there is. Yeah,
There really is, and if anybody wants to have additional information, by all means. Just as a reminder for anybody who is watching, this session is eligible for 1 hour professionalism and zero point 0.5 hours of EDI credits. Before we wrap up, I wanted to just use the a quote at page 204 that you remind us about in terms of better supporting us. You say, building wealth shouldn't be seen as greedy, but as a way to achieve financial independence and build a dream life. I love that. It can give you the stability you choose if and how much you want to work and allow you to live a comfortable life in your later years. And then you give this permission. Everyone deserves to have this, and it shouldn't be a luxury. It should be table stakes in our society. So, Janine, thank you for giving us this hope, the tools, and the language needed to smash the pink tax and embrace financial feminism. And let's keep that conversation going. I really am grateful to you for having this conversation with us.
absolutely. And, thank you so much for having me. I love having these conversations. If you want to continue the conversation with me, I'm all over social media at Janine Rogan, LinkedIn, YouTube, Instagram. I'm really bad at TikTok, but I try. Um, so definitely reach out. I love talking to women about these things.
It is all there. And just to let people know, our next conversation, a young student who is just graduating from law school has written a book. This grief thing effing sucks, and I'm really looking forward because again, during May is Mental Health Awareness, and I think it's really important to be talking about grief. Taya Mikado is somebody who I love and admire for a number of reasons, and I'm really looking forward to having the conversation with her next month. But to you, Janine, thank you for your efforts, for your research, for your presentations, and for reminding us all to have the conversations. Thanks so very much to everyone.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye bye now.